The auctioneer's voice cut across the September air like a blade through dry corn silk. Do I hear $50 for this, Oliver? Somebody, anybody. There were maybe 80 farmers standing in that gravel lot outside Minden, Nebraska, on the morning of September 14th, 1961. 80 men in worn canvas jackets and seed corn caps, standing with their arms folded and their boots muddy and their faces doing what Midwest faces do best, saying absolutely nothing. And then a hand went up. One hand slow, quiet from the back of the crowd. An old man, narrow shoulders, faded denim. A face that looked like it had been left out in 40 years of Nebraska wind and sun and grief. His name was Harold Gaines, and he was 63 years old, and he had just bid $50 on a tractor that every single person in that lot had already decided was dead. That's when Dale Fenwick started laughing. Let me tell you about Kearney County, Nebraska, in the autumn of 1961. If you've never stood in the middle of that country in September, I want you to try to picture it. The sky goes on so long and so wide that it stops feeling like sky and starts feeling like something else entirely, like a roof that God forgot to finish. The fields in those years were just coming off a good run. The early 1950s drought that had cracked the high plains and sent dust curling up into the atmosphere like something biblical, that was mostly behind them now. The rains had come back. The yields were climbing, and with them came something else. Pride and money, and the men who sold things to farmers who finally had a little of both. Kearney County sits in the south-central part of the state, bisected by the Platte River lowlands and stitched together by section roads that run perfectly and true in every cardinal direction, the way only surveyed land can. The farmsteads out there were modest, most of them 160 to 320 acres, the kind of ground a man could walk end to end before breakfast if he had a mind to. The soil along the lower ground near the river bends was heavy and dark and rich, but the upland fields had a different personality. Clay subsoil, water that sat, ground that would pull a tire down into itself if you caught it wrong. It was into this country, on a morning that smelled of turned earth and wood smoke and the particular sharpness of autumn alfalfa drying in the windrow, that 80 men gathered in the gravel lot of the late Henry Schraber's farm for a dispersal auction. Henry Schraber had died in July, no sons to take the place. His widow Edna was moving to Hastings to live with her sister. Everything on the place was going, the bins, the harrows, the cultivators, the wagons, the milk equipment, an old case corn picker, and one tractor that sat apart from everything else at the edge of the lot like something the auctioneer was embarrassed to include. A 1952 Oliver 88 row crop. And Lord, it looked it. Harold Gaines had been farming the same 180 acres east of Minden since 1931. Let me pause here and let that sink in. 1931, the year the banks were calling notes, the year the grasshoppers came, the year his father handed him a deed and a handshake and drove away in a rattling Ford truck, and Harold Gaines, then 33 years old, looked out at 180 acres of Nebraska hardpan and made himself a quiet promise. He'd buried his wife Dorothy in the spring of 1958. 3 years now she'd been gone, and if you'd asked anyone in Kearney County about Harold Gaines, they'd have told you the same thing. He kept to himself, he paid his bills, and he didn't waste words. His farm was not the biggest operation in the county. It was not the newest. His equipment line was what you might call philosophically opposed to the modern. He had a 1947 Oliver 70 that he'd kept running through sheer stubbornness, and a drawer full of machinists' tools, and a 2-row corn planter older than most of the men at the auction, and a set of field cultivator sweeps he'd sharpened so many times they were half their original width. What Harold Gaines had, and what is the kind of thing you cannot buy and cannot inherit and cannot learn from a salesman, was a feel for machinery. Not a mechanical degree, not a diploma, just 30 years of listening, of putting his hand on a valve cover and knowing from the warmth and the vibration whether something was wrong 3 hours before it broke, of reading oil color the way a doctor reads a patient's eyes, of understanding in some deep and pre-verbal way what a machine wanted to do and what it was capable of if you treated it right. His neighbor Clyde Butchhalls used to say Harold Gaines could coax 10 more years out of anything with wheels and a crankshaft. That was meant as a compliment. Most people said it like they were joking. Harold didn't mind either way. He had driven his '53 Ford pickup to the Schraber auction that September morning with no particular plan. He came to auctions the way some men went to church, not always expecting a miracle, but open to the possibility. And then he saw the Oliver. Dale Fenwick was 38 years old and ran the John Deere dealership in Minden. And if you were looking for the opposite of Harold Gaines, Dale Fenwick was a reasonable place to start. He was not a bad man, let me be careful to say that. He was not cruel in the way of someone who sets out to hurt people. He was the kind of man who had been told he was right about things so often by enough people who needed something from him that he had come to regard his own opinions the way a judge regards the law, as final, as self-evident, as not really requiring examination. He drove a 1960 Chevrolet Impala two-tone, white over turquoise, and it was always clean. He wore a John Deere dealer cap green with the yellow leaping deer that he kept blocked and clean. He sold a lot of tractors. He sold a lot of combines. He had financed equipment for half the farms in Kearney County, and he knew it, and the knowing of it had given him a particular way of standing at auctions feet wide, thumbs in his belt loops, chin up, that communicated something without saying a word. He had strong opinions about older equipment. He expressed them freely and often, and with the cheerful certainty of a man who has never once been publicly wrong. When the auctioneer called lot number 27, the 1952 Oliver 88 row crop, Dale Fenwick walked over to it with two other men from a neighboring dealer, and the three of them performed the auction equivalent of kicking a man when he's down. They walked around it. They poked at the manifold. One of them tried the crank, got nothing, and laughed. Dale Fenwick reached up and tapped the block casting with one knuckle, listened to the hollow sound, and shook his head slowly in the way of a physician delivering terminal news. "Cracked block," he announced to no one in particular and to everyone in general. "You can see the seepage right there along the head gasket line. Things haven't run in 2 seasons at least, probably 3. He said it loud enough that it carried across the lot. The auctioneer, a practical man named Gordon Albrecht, took the feedback in stride and opened the bidding at $25. "No hands. $30. Nothing. 40. And then Dale Fenwick crossed his arms and said, loud enough again, always loud enough, "Save yourself the grief, Gordon, it's parts. Maybe." Which is when Harold Gaines raised his hand and said quietly, $50. And Dale Fenwick started to laugh. It started as a chuckle. The kind of sound a man makes when he sees something that strikes him as genuinely funny, the way a child might laugh at a stumble. Then it spread the way these things do in crowds to the two dealer men beside him, and then rippled out across the lot in murmurs and head shakes and the particular body language of men who want to communicate amusement without fully committing to it. The auctioneer said, "I've got 50, do I hear 60? "Let him have it, Gordon," Dale Fenwick said. $50 and a crowbar, he can turn that into a good planter frame." More laughter, genuine this time. Harold Gaines stood with his hands still in the air, not lowered, not wavering. His face hadn't changed. It had the expression of a man waiting for a traffic light, not impatient, not bothered, just waiting for the situation to catch up to a conclusion he had already reached. The bidding stopped at $50. Harold Gaines bought the 1952 Oliver 88 row crop for $50, and a lot of other people's laughter. Gordon Albrecht moved on to the case cornpicker. Harold walked over to the Oliver and put his right hand flat against the block, the way you'd put your hand on a horse's flank to let it know you were there. He stood like that for a long moment. Then he went and found a piece of baling wire and tied the gas cap down because it was loose, and he organized about getting the tractor loaded onto his wagon without any particular hurry. Dale Fenwick walked past him on the way back to his Impala and stopped. There's a kind of man who cannot resist finishing the joke. Dale Fenwick was that kind of man. "Harold," he said pleasantly, "you know what Oliver stands for. Only lousy idiots value every rusting piece." He said it with a grin that was almost friendly, almost, and then he walked on. Harold Gaines looked up from the baling wire. He said nothing. He watched Dale Fenwick walk to his two-tone Impala and drive away, and then he went back to what he was doing. "Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a person absorb something, an insult, a dismissal, a public humiliation, and stay so completely, so perfectly still inside themselves that the cruelty just passes through them like wind through a screen door? Some people call that weakness. The ones who have lived a while know better. That's stillness. That's quiet. That is the most dangerous thing a man can carry into a contest." Harold Gaines drove the Oliver home on a flatbed trailer behind his Ford pickup, and nobody in Kearney County gave it another thought. Until 3 weeks later. Let me tell you about the 1952 Oliver 88 row crop, because this tractor matters, and it matters specifically, and the devil here is entirely in the details. The Oliver 88 was introduced in 1947, and it ran through 1954 when it was replaced by the Super 88. It was powered by a 265 cubic inch, six-cylinder engine, either gasoline or diesel, producing right around 43 drawbar horsepower, which was a serious number for 1952. The diesel variant in particular had a reputation among the men who knew Oliver Iron the way church deacons know scripture. Quiet authority, exceptional low-end torque, and a pulling character that was fundamentally different from the higher revving gasoline engines that most of its competitors offered. The 88 was also, and this is important, built with a grade of cast iron in its block that Oliver sourced from their Charles City, Iowa foundry, and it was exceptionally resistant to cracking under thermal stress. What looked like seepage along the head gasket line on Henry Schraber's tractor was not, as Dale Fenwick had confidently diagnosed, a cracked block. Harold Gaines had known this the moment he put his hand on the casting. What he felt, and I want you to understand this is not mysticism, this is 30 years of tactile knowledge, was a block that was cool and solid and dense in the way of sound iron. Cracked iron has a different feel. It is given in places it shouldn't. It sounds different when you tap it. And the seepage Harold saw along the head gasket was not from a crack. It was from a blown head gasket, a $12 repair on a good day, almost certainly caused by someone running the cooling system dry on a hot afternoon. The engine itself, Harold believed, was fine. He also noticed, while everyone else was performing for the crowd, that the fuel shutoff valve under the tank was closed. Henry Schraber, who was an organized man, had closed it when he parked the tractor for the last time. The men who tried to start it at the auction had cranked it on a dry injection system with no fuel reaching the pump. Of course, it didn't start. Harold towed the Oliver into his machine shed on a Saturday morning. By Tuesday evening, he had pulled the head, confirmed his diagnosis, 6 cylinders, all fine, pistons measuring within factory spec, replaced the head gasket with a new one he ordered from the Oliver dealer in Hastings for $9.40, cleaned the fuel system, set the injector timing, and bled the lines. On Wednesday morning, October 4th, 1961, Harold Gaines climbed up onto that Oliver 88 row crop and turned the key. She started on the third compression stroke. She settled into an idle that you could hear from the road, that steady, deep, slightly musical diesel clatter that old tractor men call the Oliver sound. Not rough, not missing. Smooth and even and patient, like a man who has been wrongly convicted and has just walked out of a courthouse into the sunshine with his head up. Harold let her warm up for 20 minutes, then he went inside and had breakfast. Now here is where the story takes a turn. Because Harold Gaines didn't fix that tractor to prove anything to anyone. He fixed it because it needed fixing, and because he needed a tractor, and because $50 plus $9.40 in parts plus his own labor was a better deal than financing a new 3010 John Deere at the price Dale Fenwick was asking that year, which was $4,200 with the row crop front. He was practical. He was always practical. But the county had a different plan for Harold Gaines and his $50 Oliver. The second week of October 1961 brought something that southern Nebraska farmers in those years dreaded almost as much as drought: an early wet fall. The rains came in on October 9th and didn't stop for 4 days. Not a soaking rain. A sitting rain, the kind that doesn't run off because the ground is already full, and so it stands in the low spots and turns the heavy clay upland fields into something that isn't quite mud and isn't quite concrete, but has properties of both, depending on what you're trying to do with it. When it finally stopped on the 13th, there were several thousand acres of standing corn in Kearney County that needed to come out. And the ground was in a condition that made every farmer in the county look at his equipment, and then look at the calendar and feel the particular tight feeling behind the sternum that comes from knowing that the first hard frost was maybe 2 weeks away. Burl Heston was one of those farmers. He ran 480 acres just north of Minden, and Burl was not a poor man. He ran a 1959 John Deere 730 diesel and had a newer case combined that he was still paying on. He was a neighbor of Harold's approximately, in the way that Nebraska neighbors are approximately, meaning they lived 3 miles apart and saw each other at the co-op. Burl had a backfield 92 acres of upland clay ground that sat on a slight depression where the water just would not leave. He'd been watching it for 4 days. On October 15th, a Saturday, he decided it was dry enough, climbed on his 730, and pulled his 4-row John Deere corn head into the field. He was stuck for 45 minutes, buried to the axles in the second low spot, his rear tires spinning down into the clay and making a sound like something angry and ashamed. Let me tell you about the scene that gathered over the next 2 hours. Because in small counties in 1961, this kind of thing was still a community event. 3 more tractors came out to help. 2 of them got stuck. The third, Dale Fenwick's personal 3010, which he'd driven out from town in his farm clothes, because this was also the kind of event a dealer showed up to manage to stay on solid ground, but couldn't generate the angle needed to pull the 730 without jackknifing the chain. By noon, there were 6 men standing in a wet field arguing about physics and chain angles and the relative merits of various approaches, none of which were working. Harold Gaines drove by on the section road in his '53 Ford at approximately 12:15 in the afternoon. He slowed down, he looked at the field, he looked at the stuck equipment, he looked at the men standing around it. He pulled over. He got out, he walked to the field edge and stood there for a while, looking at the situation the way he looked at everything, quietly, without comment, taking the information in. Burl Heston walked over. He was muddy to the knee, and his face had the expression of a man who had stopped being embarrassed about an hour ago and had moved on to just needing the problem solved. "Harold," he said, "you got anything that might pull this? Now this is the moment. This is the moment I want you to hold." Because Harold Gaines had every reason to keep driving, every reason. He owed Burl Heston nothing. He owed the men standing in that field nothing. And he owed Dale Fenwick, who was standing 30 yards away in his clean farm coat looking at Harold's truck with a complicated expression, he owed Dale Fenwick less than nothing. Harold said, "I might." He drove home. He was back in 35 minutes with the Oliver 88 on his flatbed trailer. There is a sound that a group of men makes when they see something arrive that they didn't expect and aren't sure how to feel about. It is not quite laughter and not quite silence. It is something in between, a shifting, a murmuring, a recalibration. Dale Fenwick said loud enough, "Harold, you brought a $50 museum piece to pull out a $4,000 tractor." He wasn't laughing now exactly, but he wasn't laughing. Harold unloaded the Oliver. She started immediately, that deep, even diesel idle coming out of her like a statement of fact. Harold drove her to the field edge and looked at the ground. Now here is what Harold understood that the other men did not, or had not thought to apply. The problem was not power. The 730 stuck in that field had more than enough power. The problem was contact. Clay ground that is saturated does not give you traction by compressing, it gives way, lubrication-like, and the more aggressively a tire spins, the more it polishes the surface beneath it. What you needed was not more RPM or more torque delivered in a burst. You needed sustained, low, steady pull, constant tension. No spinning, no surging, applied long enough for the stuck machine to rock up onto firmer clay millimeter by millimeter. The 1952 Oliver 88 diesel, in its low range at about 1,400 RPM, produced a pulling character that was, as the men who tested it at Purdue's Ag Engineering program noted in 1952, unusually linear and sustained. She did not lunge. She did not spike. She pulled like a slow-tide, even, relentless patient. Harold hooked a log chain to the 730's front axle. He positioned the Oliver at an angle not straight back, which would have pulled Burl's machine deeper into the soft depression, but at a 30-degree angle toward the nearest solid ridge of clay ground. He looked back once, he looked forward. He let the Oliver ease into the load. The chain came tight. The Oliver's rear tires, Harold's original dual rear configuration, 12-inch rims, good tread, pressed into the firm clay of the field approach. The engine note dropped from idle to pull, that characteristic deepening, almost a groan, that a diesel makes when it meets real resistance. Oh, she did not spin. The 730 didn't move. Not at first. Not for almost 90 seconds, while Harold held that steady throttle and the Oliver held that steady pull, and nothing visible happened except that the chain stayed tight and straight. And the men watching said later they almost missed it. Burl Heston's 730 moved. Not a jerk, not a sudden release. It moved the way a stuck drawer moves when you stop yanking at it and just pull steadily, gradually, inevitably 1 inch, then another, the clay releasing its hold with a long sucking sound that the men in the field described differently depending on who you asked. Some said it sounded like a boot pulled from mud. Some said it sounded like something giving up. The 730 came out of the hole in one long, slow, smooth arc, and followed the Oliver's lead onto solid ground. The whole pull had taken 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Harold Gaines killed the Oliver's engine. He climbed down, he unhooked the chain. He coiled it and hung it on the drawbar. He looked at the 730, now sitting safe on solid ground, and he looked at Burl, who was staring at the Oliver with the expression of a man revising something he thought he understood. And then Harold Gaines turned around and looked at the rest of the field, 92 acres of wet clay with standing corn, and he said the only thing he said for the next 6 hours. He said, "You want me to pull that corn?" 6 hours. That is how long Harold Gaines worked Burl Heston's backfield on October 15, 1961. He did not take a lunch break. He took 2 short stops, one at the far end to check the chain tension on the combine header he was pulling through, once to re-examine a low spot that was wetter than the rest. He worked with the systematic patience of a man who understands that the field has its own logic and you don't fight it, you read it. The Oliver 88 did not get stuck, not once. What Harold had that none of the other rigs had besides that diesel pull characteristic and 30 years of field sense was a weight distribution and a tire setup that kept the rear end planted without punishing the ground beneath it. He worked the wet spots on the diagonals, the way a sailboat tacks against the wind. He kept his speed low and his RPMs consistent. He read the clay color changes, darker clay was wetter, lighter clay was firmer, and he adjusted his line accordingly, sometimes crossing back over ground he'd already passed to give the firmer ridges between the rows time to drain. The men who had gathered, and by mid-afternoon there were 15 or 20 of them, farmers from adjacent sections who had heard about the stuck equipment and come to watch, the way people do when the problem is interesting enough, stood at the field edge for most of those 6 hours. They didn't talk much. There is a particular silence that falls over a crowd of practical men when they are watching someone do something they themselves could not do, and doing it with an ease that makes it look simple, and doing it on equipment they had laughed at 3 weeks earlier. That silence had a specific weight to it. Dale Fenwick stood with his arms crossed for the first 2 hours, then he put his hands in his pockets, then he leaned against his truck. At some point in the late afternoon he got in his truck. He sat there for a while. He drove away before Harold finished the field. When Harold Gaines made his last pass and brought the combine header out on the east end of the field, Burl Heston walked out to meet him. He reached up and shook Harold's hand and held it a long moment. He said something. Harold nodded, that was all. By the account of the men standing at the field edge, nobody said anything to fill the space that Dale Fenwick had left by laughing 3 weeks earlier. Nobody needed to. Let me tell you what happened in the weeks and months and years that followed, because the ripple of a thing like this moves further than anyone standing at the field edge can see. Burl Heston paid Harold Gaines $80 for the work that afternoon. Harold tried to say it was too much. Burl said it was not enough, and that was the end of the discussion. Word traveled the way it does in county seat country, not through newspapers or official announcement, but through the language of men at the co-op counter, at the elevator, at the coffee table, at the Minden Cafe that the farmers used every Tuesday and Thursday morning. Not a dramatic retelling. Just the facts passed along plainly the way you'd pass along weather information. Harold Gaines pulled that Oliver out of the junk pile for $50. Ran it home, fixed it himself, put it in the field. Pulled the 730 out of Burl's back field when nothing else could. Pulled the corn, the field looks good. 3 farmers called Harold that October asking if he'd be available with the Oliver for custom work. He took 2 of the jobs. The following spring, 1962, a young farmer named Gene Pospichel, 26 years old, recently married, farming 160 acres on shares north of Axtell, drove out to Harold's place on a Saturday morning. He'd heard the story. He wanted to know if Harold thought there were other Oliver 88s out there worth buying and what he should look for if he found one. Harold walked him around the tractor for 2 hours. He showed him where to look for heat cracks in the manifold. He showed him how to read the color and feel of the cast iron. He showed him what good injector timing sounded like versus retarded timing. He showed him the valve adjustment and what the clearance should feel like with a feeler gauge. Gene Pospichel went home and found a 1953 Oliver Super 88 on a farm sale in Phelps County for $75. He put it into service that spring. Gene Pospichel farmed that Phelps County ground for 41 years. Now let me tell you about Dale Fenwick. Because this story would be incomplete without that chapter, and the chapter is more complicated than the laughter at the auction. Dale Fenwick was not a fundamentally dishonest man. He was a man who had made a public pronouncement based on a brief inspection and a confident assumption, and he had been publicly wrong about it in the most visible way possible. That kind of thing sits differently in different men. In the winter of 1961-62, Dale Fenwick drove out to Harold Gaines' farm on a Thursday afternoon. Harold was in the machine shed, sharpening cultivator sweeps. The shed smelled of metal and oil and the particular dryness of winter air in a heated workspace. Dale Fenwick stood in the doorway for a moment, then he walked in. He said, "I was wrong about the Oliver." Harold kept filing the sweep he was working on. Dale said, "I called it wrong at the auction. I said it loud. I should say this loud too." Harold set the sweep down. He looked at Dale for a long moment. Then he said, "You want coffee?" They sat in Harold's kitchen for 45 minutes. They talked about engines. They talked about the difference between gasoline pull and diesel pull. Dale Fenwick, who sold John Deere diesel tractors and therefore understood diesel characteristics, admitted that he had not applied what he knew to what he was seeing, that the Oliver's reputation for bottom-end torque was real, and he knew it was real, and he had let his opinion of the machine's condition override his knowledge of its design. He was honest about it. Men who can be honest about being wrong when they've been publicly wronged, that's a particular kind of character. It doesn't undo the laughter at the auction, but it means something. Harold Gaines sold 2 pieces of old equipment to Dale Fenwick over the next 3 years, at fair prices, and Fenwick put them on the used lot without editorializing about their origins. The 1952 Oliver 88 row crop that Harold bought for $50 and $9.40 in parts worked on Harold's farm until 1974. 13 years of Nebraska fields, corn, milo, alfalfa, custom work for neighbors. Harold kept meticulous records, the way farmers who grew up in the Depression kept records. Total repair expense over those 13 years, including a set of rear tires in 1966 and a starter motor in 1969, $487. He sold her in 1974 to a young man in Gosper County who wanted her for a garden tractor operation and didn't have a lot of money. Harold charged him $150. The young man drove 3 hours to pick her up. He started her before he put her on the trailer. That diesel sound came out of her, steady, deep, even exactly as it had the first morning Harold had turned her over in the machine shed in October 1961. Harold watched her go down the county road on the flatbed. He stood there for a while. Then he went inside. He lived until 1979. He farmed until 1977. He never bought a new tractor. Let me ask you something before we close. When was the last time you walked away from something because someone more confident than you told you it was worthless? Think about that honestly, because it happens. It happens all the time. Not on farm auction lots necessarily, maybe in a conversation, maybe in a career decision, maybe in a relationship, maybe in your own quiet assessment of yourself. Someone with a louder voice and a cleaner car and a more practiced authority stands up and announces what is and isn't worth anything, and the crowd shifts, and suddenly the thing you were considering looks different. Harold Gaines was 63 years old, a widower standing in a gravel lot in Kearney County, Nebraska, and he raised his hand anyway. He raised it because he had put his hand on that cast iron block, and he knew what he felt, and he had 30 years of knowledge that had not come from a sales brochure or a dealer's lot or the opinion of 80 men who had decided collectively that the tractor was dead. His knowledge had come from mornings in machine sheds and afternoons in fields, and the slow accumulation of attention paid to real things over a long working life. That kind of knowledge doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a clean cap. It doesn't drive a two-tone Impala. It stands quietly at the back of the crowd with its hand up and it waits. Let me tell you what I think the real lesson of Harold Gaines is. And it's not about tractors, not exactly. It's about the difference between visible confidence and actual knowledge. We live in a world, and this was true in 1961, and it is more true today, that rewards the performance of confidence. That mistakes volume for wisdom, presentation for competence, and newness for value. Dale Fenwick was not stupid. He was successful. He sold a lot of tractors. He knew a great deal about his product. But he made his pronouncement from the outside of the machine, from the surface, from what the machine looked like rather than what it was. He announced his conclusion before he had finished his examination, because the crowd was listening and he was accustomed to being right, and the two feelings together are comfortable in a dangerous way. Harold examined from the inside. He put his hand on the block. He thought about what a closed fuel shutoff valve meant. He thought about what that particular quality of seepage said about the head gasket versus the block casting. He had no audience and no reputation to protect, and so he saw clearly. There are Harold Gainasees everywhere. In every county, in every field, in every industry, neighborhood, and community. They are not loud, they are not always young. They often drive older trucks. They frequently have knowledge that they carry without broadcasting because they grew up in a world that taught you to work first and talk after. They are worth listening to. The old machines are worth looking at twice. The thing that everyone else has decided is dead, sometimes just has a closed fuel valve and a blown head gasket. And the man willing to put his hand on the block, really put his hand on it, without deciding first what he's going to feel, that man will often know something the crowd does not. Harold Gaines knew. The Oliver knew. And on a wet October afternoon in Kearney County, Nebraska, with the clay smell rising off the field and the combine header moving through standing corn and 15 farmers standing silent at the fence line, that knowing was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.